Hey everyone. In this unit, I want to talk about how the scientific method can apply to psychological science. So, in general, when we're talking about the goals of science, we want to be able to describe things that are happening, and hopefully we can then predict when those things will happen. Even better, if we can control the things that cause something to happen, and ultimately we want to be able to explain why things happen. And these are the goals of psychology and psychological science as well. So let's talk a little about the scientific method. You start off by formulating a theory. So a theory is a coherent set of ideas that describe, explain, or predict some type of phenomenon. A good theory is going to be falsifiable. In other words, it can be proven wrong. It isn't something that will always be right, that even if you find contradicting evidence, well, you can still fit it in your worldview here. Instead, it needs to be something that if the theory is incorrect, you can actually discover that it's wrong. Additionally, we look for parsimony. We look for something that is a simple answer, or at least one that's a straightforward. Something that's not overly complicated, that doesn't require um, uh, things that are just fantastic or whatnot. And we often do all of this by first going to the literature. We read up on what prior research has been done about a phenomenon, and then we try to see, okay, based on prior research, what is the most likely explanation for the phenomenon that we're observing? From this, we develop a testable hypothesis. This is a specific prediction that's derived from our theory. If this theory is true, then we should be able to see something in a particular case. So, this consists of a testable prediction that should be observed if the theory is correct. So, I did a study years ago that was looking at possible treatments for obstructive sleep apnea. And there was a theory that if we can strengthen the muscles in the throat, that that would help people. So obstructive sleep apnea is when you stop breathing during the night, and often the neck collapses for a person when they're asleep, which causes them to stop breathing. And so there was a theory that if you strengthen those muscles, then that could protect somebody from obstructive sleep apnea. And this is based on prior research, especially research that had been done on people with respirators. So there was a reason to believe that this might work as a treatment for obstructive sleep apnea. So then we wanted to develop a hypothesis. So if it is true that building up the muscles in the throat can lower sleep apnea, then we speculated that people who already have stronger neck muscles, especially internal. I'm not talking about your neck muscles from working out, but what we were looking at actually was musicians, and not all musicians, specifically ones that played against instruments that had high pressure, because that is what would cause the most buildup of muscles. So we have specific theory that woodwind, especially double reed instruments, so this is like on the oboe or the bassoon, or high brass players, trumpets and French horns, would have lower incidences of sleep apnea if it's really true that blowing against resistance will build up these throat muscles and therefore make it less likely that you have obstructive sleep apnea. So now we had a testable hypothesis. We could go out and look at musicians, see what their likelihood, their probability of having obstructive sleep apnea, and see whether what instrument that they played made a difference. And so we can test this using a research method. And we're going to talk a little about these later. But these are systematic ways of collecting data that is used to either prove or disprove our hypothesis. And there's three main ones that we'll discuss: descriptive research, correlational research, and experimental research. So we went out, and for this study, we did this. We collected almost information from almost 1,000 musicians who played in orchestras, and we looked at those who played the high brass and the double reed woodwinds, compared that to other woodwind and brass players, tuba players, trombone players, clarinet players, and we even compared it to string players. They served as kind of our control group because people who played the violin or viola don't have to blow at all. And so we gathered that data and then we analyzed it. So we used statistical techniques that then allowed us to see whether or not there was what we call a significant effect. When you're using statistics, you are trying to determine whether or not it's more or less likely that the results you have are what we call statistically significant. And that's a very specific term for when we think we have data that supports our hypothesis. After we do the analysis, we then want to share it with other people. It doesn't do any good to do research and then just keep it to yourself. You want to disseminate it. And so we presented at conferences, we publish journal articles, we do things that get that information out to other scientists. Now, it's very important that when you're doing this, that you don't do what we call cherry picking data, that we don't just go through and look at the things that work. So for my study with musicians and sleep apnea, I did in fact find that double reed instrument players had a lower incidence of obstructive sleep apnea. So it's possible that playing the oboe or playing the bassoon actually does have something that protects you from obstructive sleep apnea. On the other hand, the trumpet players and the French horn players did not have a difference in their sleep apnea rates. So that kind of goes against our original theory that we had, that this was purely something about building up muscle strength in the throat from blowing against something of high resistance. And maybe something else is actually going on here. Now, one thing that's important when you do research, and this, whenever you hear a study, you hear on the news or you get something that flashes up on your feed, um, you can't take any one study and think of it as being the truth. There are all kinds of things, statistical anomalies and whatnot, that can go in that can make any one study odd and get invalid results. And not something that's scientific misconduct or whatnot, but just by dumb luck, a person can either find an effect or fail to find an effect. And it has nothing to do with anything that they did. It was just simply bad luck. So it's always important that we have replications. So for my study, there was another group at the University of Michigan who was also exploring the musicians and obstructive sleep apnea, and they did not find any relationship between playing a wind instrument and obstructive sleep apnea. Though I later talked with one of the researchers from there, and they reanalyzed their data the way I did, and looking more specifically at the specific instruments instead of just looking at all wind instruments together. And they were able to replicate the results that I got. We still don't know why it is that the oboe and bassoon players and not other instruments have this effect, but it's interesting nonetheless. So, one thing that kind of makes people question psychology being a true science is that we deal in what we call hypothetical constructs. This is something that we know exists, but we don't have a direct measure of it. So, how do you define happiness? How do you define intelligence? How do you define attractive? See, these are all things that we intuitively know what they mean. We know what it is to be happy. But how would you actually measure that in a research study? And so to do this, we have to develop things called operational definitions. This is where we take a psychological process and we define it as something to measure. So if we want to measure intelligence, you could say a person's score on an IQ test will be our operational definition of intelligence. Or if we want to define attractiveness, we could say a person's rating on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being unattractive and 10 being very attractive, the average rating of a person will be our measure of attractiveness. So you have to figure out some way to quantify things. Now, this isn't just a unique problem in psychology, and it's something that I feel that a lot of people kind of overlook when they're kind of criticizing psychology as a science. Psychology fits in a larger area of research of life science. And this can include biology, medicine, nutrition, exercise science, heck, even things like economics. And the problem is that we deal with variability. When we're dealing with living organisms, whether it's humans or it's puppy dogs or salamanders or bacteria, when we're dealing with things that are living, they don't all react the same. If you're a chemist, if you do everything correctly, when you mix two chemicals together, they should react the same way every time. And when they don't react that same way, it's probably that you messed something up. The thermometer was off on your temperature. You didn't measure out the right amount of solvent. There was something wrong with the detector that was measuring what you were doing. But when we're dealing with any type of living organism, we have to deal with variability. And not just variability between different organisms, but even variability over time. An answer that I give you today can be completely different than the answer I would give you tomorrow. And the answer that you give to something will likely be very different than the answer I give something. So we're dealing with this variability, and we're dealing with these operational definitions of hypothetical constructs. And so that makes some people feel that psychology is a squishy science, that we don't have these hard and fast definitions. But you run into this in other areas of research as well. Let's say that I want to do research on smokers versus non-smokers. What is a smoker? How much do you need to smoke to be a smoker? If you say anything, if you've ever lit up a cigarette in your life, you're a smoker. Would you really think that somebody who smokes, say, a pack a day would be the same as someone who smoked 1 cigarette once in their life? Or what if there's somebody who is what I've heard called a social smoker, that maybe occasionally they go out with friends on the weekend and they have a cigarette. So it's constant, but it's a much less degree than someone who maybe smokes a pack or more a day. So would we group those people together? And does it have to be a cigarette? What if somebody smokes marijuana? What if someone smokes a pipe, a tobacco pipe? What would you define as a smoker? And the thing is you could talk to a lot of different people, a lot of different experts, and you could get a lot of different definitions. And this is really no different than what we run into when we're trying to define some concept like happiness or intelligence. But yet, one is what you would more likely see in a medical study, and the other is something you'd more likely find in a psychological study. But yet, we still deal with the same type of issues. But I don't hear many people complain with the idea that medical science is a type of science. So let's talk about some of those methods describing how we do collect data in psychology. And so, one way we do this is descriptive research. And one way that we can describe behaviors is through what we call case studies. So, case studies are where you intensively examine either one person or one organization or a small group of people. The example I have here is a fellow named Phineas Gage, who 150 years ago was working on a railroad and due to an accident had a rod that shot up through his skull and damaged the frontal part of his brain. Following that, which so amazing that he survived such an accident. But one of the most notable things was that he had a change in his personality. He became more combative. He couldn't plan. He'd been a very serious and industrious and well organized individual, and afterwards he became quick tempered. He couldn't follow through on things. He would say inappropriate things, and we were able to make conclusions about what the function of the frontal part of your brain is. And that one of them is that it provides behavioral inhibition. It also provides for our ability to think and to plan and to organize things. And so, by looking at one individual and looking at this kind of horrible accident that happened, we're able to make some very specific predictions about the function of the brain. Another way we can describe behavior is through observational studies, where we have systematic ways of assessing and coding behavior. You could imagine somebody who is watching a classroom of children and is recording how many times they get up out of their seats or they display an aggressive behavior or off task or something like that. The picture here is showing Jane Goodall observing chimpanzees, and so you can have two different types of observational studies. You can have those where the researcher directly interacts with the participant. So if you were watching children, you would be in the room. Maybe you're even playing with the child and you're listening to see what kind of behaviors the child has if you hand the child something or if you take something away. You can also have observation without intervention. Maybe you're watching the participant through a one-way mirror, or through a camera system, or you're otherwise not in the field of view of the participant. Now, one thing that we have to be really careful about in this is that we have to be very careful about observer bias, that you are not injecting in your own thoughts into the behaviors that you're observing. And typically we do this by having strong definitions, operational definitions. If we want to say a child is off task, we need to have a very clear definition so that if I'm watching a child and you're watching that same child, that we both come to the same conclusion. And often this is how we measure this, that we have more than one person coding the behavior and we check to see whether or not we agree on the behaviors. Another thing we have to worry about is what we call reactivity that comes from the participants. So there's a famous set of studies that that we where they were looking at productivity in a factory setting. And they wanted to see whether changes to, say, like environmental conditions would change the speed in which people were working. And so one thing they did is they tried to make the lights brighter. And what they found is when they did that, that the workers did work faster. And then to kind of control for this, they then lowered the lighting level. And then the workers also worked faster. In fact, whatever it was that they tried to do, whatever manipulation they did, workers always worked faster. And it took them a little bit to realize that it wasn't actually the manipulations that they were doing. Instead, it was about that there were these people walking around with clipboards who were looking over people's shoulders, counting how fast they could do things. And people tended to work faster when somebody was watching them. So we called this the Hawthorne effect because that was the name of the place where they were doing all these studies. But basically, when people know they're being observed, they can behave differently. So we have to be very careful of this when we're doing some type of observational study. Another way we can describe behavior is through self report questionnaires or surveys. This is a good way to get a large amount of data from many people that we can use, whether we're doing it paper and pencil, we're doing it over the internet, that we can get, in the case of that obstructive sleep apnea study, we're able to collect data from 1,000 participants in a relatively short amount of time who lived all across the country. And this was something that I would not have been able to observe this. I wouldn't have been able to go to that many orchestras and like watch people observe them. But instead, I was able to use a questionnaire and get a large number of people from a diverse cross section of the country in order to answer the question that I was asking. Another way that we can do this is through interviews. So, interviews work really well when we're kind of exploring, when we don't know exactly what the answers are that we're looking for. Sometimes you do an interview first, that when you're starting out a new research project, then you might interview some people so that you can start to get an idea of what the possible range of answers that people have for why they do what they do, or how they feel, or what have you. And then once you have a kind of an idea of what the range of responses are, you can then create a survey or a questionnaire that can then be sent out to a large number of people. Now, one thing that we have to watch out for when we're doing this type of research is that people often want to be seen as good. And so people can give answers that make them feel like they're presenting themselves in a better light. Other times, people just want to be helpful, and they give the answer that they think the researcher wants or should get because they think they're helping the experiment. That they don't want to be the oddball out. They want to give the answer that gives the data that confirms what the research study is doing. So we have to be very careful in how we're constructing these types of questionnaires, surveys, or interviews to guard for this kind of self-report bias. Another way that we do research in psychology is through correlational methods. This examines how variables are naturally related in the real world. In this, you measure two factors and then you determine how associated they are and in what direction they are. If one variable increases, does the other one increase or decrease? If I wanted to know if study time affected how people perform on an exam, would I see people who study more perform better? In other words, they move at the same direction? Or would I find that people who study more perform worse? And that would be at the opposite end. They perform oppositely instead of together. So One thing when we're doing correlational methods is that there's no attempt to alter the variables. Also, we can't assign causation. Just because I see that the more hours somebody studies, the better that they perform on a test, it doesn't actually mean that the increased study time was the reason for the test performance. Correlational methodology just simply doesn't answer that question. And one reason is because there's a directionality problem whenever we're dealing with correlational data. So let's say that there is a relationship between self esteem and achievement. And people who have higher levels of self esteem tend to have better achievement. So, does that mean that self esteem causes high achievement? Or is it that people who have high levels of achievement get boost to their self esteem? Another problem that we run into with correlational methods is what we call the third variable problem. Maybe self esteem and achievement aren't something that cause each other. Maybe there's a third variable. Maybe there's something about parental support. People who have higher levels of parental support have higher levels of self esteem and have higher levels of achievement. Or maybe there's something about personality traits that explains either some or part of this relationship. And this is why we can't just use correlational methodology to answer causality. Correlation does not cause or does not result in causation. If we do want to understand why something causes something else, then we need to look at experimental methods. So experimental methods are research methods um, that are specifically meant to test whether one thing causes another. So in this type of setup, we have a variable that we manipulate, that we have two groups, at least two groups, and we keep everything possible the same between those two groups, except for the one variable that we manipulate. We call this the independent variable. And then we look to see whether there is a difference in our outcome variable, which is known as the dependent variable. So if I wanted to know, does more levels of studying cause you to do better on a test? To actually answer that question, I would want to set up an experiment where I have two groups of people, one group who studied a lot, one group who didn't study, and then I could compare the outcome of those. If everything else was the same, I'd want to make sure that everyone in my study all attended the same amount of class, they all had access to the same amounts of material, that everything was the same between those two groups, except for the one independent variable, in this case, time. So it's important when we have an experimental group that we have something that makes a comparison, that we have a control group, which is our baseline group, that it does not have any kind of intervention, and we have an experimental group, which is our treatment group that does receive the manipulation. But it's also important that we don't have lots of things changing at the same time. That we need to have that one variable, and there's ways to have more than one variable, but that we very purposefully only have the one variable that differs between the groups, so that we can make a statement that okay, everything was the same between these two groups. So if we see a difference in our outcome, that dependent variable, it must be due to that variable that we manipulated. So control is necessary to determine causality. A properly performed experiment depends on the control, which are steps to minimize that anything else other than the independent variable will affect the outcome. Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to eliminate what we call confounds. Anything that affects the dependent variable unintentionally. And this becomes a source of error that gets added to our study. So we want to eliminate as many confounds as possible so that the only explanation about why I saw a difference between my groups and the dependent variable was because of the manipulation. Now, some terminology when we're dealing with research studies like this. A population is the general group an experimenter wants to know about. Now, populations can vary. Sometimes we want to know something about all humans on Earth. Sometimes we want to know about all men or all women. Or maybe we want to know about people who live in Houston or students at UHCL or people who work in the accounting department. So our populations just depend on what group are we hoping to study. Now, usually these populations are much larger than what it is that we can possibly do a study. If I want to know the polls or the who someone's going to vote for in the next national election, it's not going to be possible for me to get all of the millions of people on the telephone and ask them, hey, who are you going to vote for? But I can have a sample. A sample is a group of people who are selected from the population who's going to be part of my study. Sampling is then how I generate that sample. So, sampling is the methodology that I use to get hopefully a representative group of people who's going to be in my study. Though sometimes we don't have the best ways to get a truly representative sample. Sometimes we are dealing with what we call a convenience sample. So if I wanted to know about people's attitudes and I don't have the ability to call anyone in the United States, I might instead just simply ask college students at our university. And so this could give us some idea of what people believe, but student beliefs here at UHCL might be different than people who live in Maine or in California or in Wyoming. So, convenience samples are often used in psychology, and it sometimes just depends on what kind of study that we're actually doing. If I want to do a study on reaction time, well, a person who lives in Houston probably is the same as someone who lives in Wyoming. But if I'm doing something about somebody's beliefs about something, well, it's possible that someone who lives in Houston might have a different set of beliefs than someone who lives in another part of the country. So, how do we get these samples from the population? Ideally, we use something called a random sample. A random sample is one that where your sample represents the population because any individual in the population has an equal likelihood of being included in that sample. So you can imagine if you had a big jar of marbles and you reach your hand in and you pull one out, that's a fairly random method that any one of those marbles could have been selected to be there. And so this is what you see in, say, large telephone poles where they use random number generators to randomly generate a phone number, and then they call, and whoever answers it is who they then ask their questions to. That could be an example of a random sample done in a large scale population. On the other hand, if I wanted to do, if my population was smaller, let's say I wanted to do a satisfaction survey of students at UHCL, well, they'd be a little easier to go and find the 8,000 students at the university, and then I could put them into a computer program and I could have it randomly spit out a couple hundred people, and then those could people I invite to take my survey. Now, a term that sometimes people get confused is random assignment. Random assignment is how we create our control and experimental groups in an experiment. In random assignment, everyone who is in our sample can then be randomly assigned to one of ever how many groups I have. You can flip a coin, you can use a computer program to get random numbers. So we use random sampling to select a sample of people from the population. And then we use random assignment to take those people in our sample and randomly assign them to experimental or control groups. Another type of experimental group that's important to point out when we're looking at psychology research is what we call the quasi experiment. And these studies look like an experiment. We have two or more groups and we have an outcome variable and we look to see if there's a difference between the groups. But we can't use random assignment. And so these are things like subject variables. I'll go back to my example earlier about a smoker versus a non smoker. Once we determine what our definition is for these, and then we want to do that study, well, I can't really randomly assign people. I can't go through, flip a coin, and say, okay, you now smoke a pack a day. That's not the way that works. We couldn't even ethically do that, and nor would they even really make sense to do that. Instead, you would have people come in, you'd give them some kind of questionnaire on their smoking habits, and then based on that, you would assign them to either the smoking or the non smoking group. And so that doesn't have random assignment. And therefore, that's not a true experiment. It becomes a quasi experiment. We do the same thing if we're talking about wanting to know the difference between 5-year olds and 10-year olds and how they do a logic problem. I can't randomly assign, I can't flip a coin and say, okay, you're 5 years old, and flip another coin, okay, you're 10 years old. People come in already like that. Or a pre-test and a post-test. Maybe I want to know your attitudes about a particular topic. And then I'm going to show you a video. And then I want to know if that changes your attitudes. I can't randomly assign you to either the pre-test or the post-test. It comes in order. You're always going to be the pre-test before you see the video, and you'll always be the post-test after the video. Now, what this means is that when we do these kind of studies, even though they kind of look like, we even analyze them in the same ways we do experimental studies, we can't draw the same conclusions about causation. Instead, they're interpreted more similarly to a correlational study, where we recognize that there could be lots of other factors that we didn't control for that could explain why the results that we got. Another important thing that when we're doing psychological research is to be aware of ethics. We are dealing with people or animals, we're dealing with living organisms. And we need to have a framework, an ethical framework in which we're working with these living organisms. And so, as psychology, one of the main ones we work with is the APA's Ethical Principles of Psychologists and Code of Conduct, which defines the generally accepted ethical principles for people in the field of psychology. Whenever we do a research study with humans, we have a group called an institutional review board, which is a group of people who are responsible for reviewing a research project before it's done to make sure that we are living up to the ethical standards of doing research with humans. For people who do research with animals, there is an equivalent type group called the Animal Care and Use Committee, also known as the IACUC, which review proposed research and ensure the proper welfare of animals that are used in either research or in teaching. So when doing research with humans, there's some important concepts that we have to be mindful of. This includes things like privacy, that the research results are confidential and that we do everything possible to keep those results confidential, that we have informed consent, that people must knowingly, that's the informed part, that the person has to understand what it is that they're agreeing to, and they must agree to participate in the study. And that researchers do everything possible to protect participants from any type of pain or discomfort. And there's a risk benefit ratio that we have to be very mindful of, that we don't unnecessarily um, uh, subject somebody to something that's painful or discomfort when there's relatively little to gain from it. If we were a medical doctor and we had an experimental surgery that we thought might be able to cure a person's cancer, that's a different type of risk benefit ratio. That going through a surgery is painful and uncomfortable, but it could have a great deal of benefit. On the other hand, if we are doing something about what some person's consumer preference is for something, well, maybe that doesn't have the same type of societal benefit. And so, therefore, we might be not interested in, say, something that would be truly painful or discomforting for someone to go through. Another thing we need to be mindful of when we're doing research is looking at diversity. So, diversity refers to characteristics that make us seem different from another. And this can include all types of different things that make people different. And so, whether this is the race or ethnicity or biological sex, the language you speak, your religion, your gender, your age, socioeconomic status, all of these things kind of go into making a person who they are. Now, some we have to recognize when we're looking at psychology research. The vast majority of this research has been conducted in Western industrialized countries. We also know that culture, which are the beliefs and values and rules and customs that exist within a group of people, can affect a person's psychological processes. So when we only look at a narrow band of people only from particular types of cultures, we actually are getting a very narrow view of psychology that maybe is only explaining how people respond in America or in Western industrialized countries. And we're not getting a true sense of human behavior. A really kind of interesting example of this is this illusion. So, in these studies, participants are basically tested to see when they think the line one and line two are the same or different. And what we see is that if we look at people in the United States, that there is there is a much larger difference needed between line one and line two before that they can identify that they're different. Whereas when looking at other cultures, in this case in Africa, you can see that there's a wide variety to some people who can perceive this the slightest difference in the distance between the lines, the same type of study, but yet has a different perception. So this isn't even something about a cultural belief, but a question of sensation and perception, a physiological reaction, a cognitive task that we can even see differences among those with different cultural backgrounds. So it's important that we look at all of this and that we have representative groups. And this is where it's not necessarily that your one study needs to go and find people from all over the world, but this is the importance of replication. If I do a study here in the United States, would somebody in Brazil find the same thing? Would somebody in South Africa or in China or in New Zealand? Would they find the same types of outcomes? And so this is very important and something that has gained, especially in the last couple of decades, a much greater recognition that in order for us to fully describe behavior, that we really do need to have a diverse set of individuals in our study.